The pilot was looking right at me. Through the smoke and the chaos, through the screams of his engine and the thunder of our guns, his eyes met mine. In that frozen moment, I saw not a monster, but a man, a boy no older than myself, and he was aiming his entire world, his life, his very soul directly at my heart. He wasn't pulling up. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The air in the underground bunker on Luzon was thick with the ghosts of past defeats and the smoke of 1,000 nervous cigarettes. It was late 1944, and the Empire of Japan was bleeding, its lifeblood draining away into the vast, unforgiving Pacific. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, a man whose face seemed carved from granite and despair, stood before his pilots. The dim, flickering lights cast long, dancing shadows, making the young men look like specters in their sweat-stained flight suits. They were the last of a dying breed, the final, tattered remnants of a once mighty naval air force that had struck terror across the ocean. Onishi's voice was a low, gravelly thing, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire war. "The fate of our empire," he began, his gaze sweeping across the tense, youthful faces, "rests upon your wings. You are not merely pilots any longer. You are to become the divine wind, the Kamikaze, that will sweep the enemy from our sacred seas." He chose his words with the precision of a surgeon, carefully excising the blunt, brutal word suicide and replacing it with honor, with destiny, with a poetic, tragic glory. He spoke of cherry blossoms, beautiful in their brief, spectacular fall, a metaphor that was not lost on the young men who were about to become just that, scattered petals in a storm of steel. Among them was Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka, a pilot who, a year earlier, would have been considered an ace. He possessed a rare combination of skill, experience, and an innate love for the intricate, deadly dance of aerial combat. He had felt the thrill of outmaneuvering an enemy, the satisfaction of a perfectly executed deflection shot, the quiet pride of bringing his damaged bird back home. Now, all of that was irrelevant. His skill was a currency that had lost all value. He listened to Onishi's speech, a cold, hard knot tightening in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't strategy. It was ritual sacrifice. He glanced at Ensign Sato, a boy of 17 with a face as smooth and unlined as a porcelain cup, his eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of patriotic fervor and ill-concealed dread. Sato was clutching a small white sash, the hachimaki, a symbol of his commitment to this final, fatal flight. He looked like a child playing dress, up in his father's uniform, about to be consumed by a game he couldn't possibly understand. Kenji leaned towards a fellow veteran pilot, a man named Yoshida, whose face was a roadmap of narrow escapes and bitter losses. His voice was a barely audible whisper against the Admiral's resonant speech. "Is this what it has come to, Yoshida? Our skill means nothing now, only our willingness to die." Yoshida simply stared ahead, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable, but Kenji saw the flicker of despair in his old friend's eyes. The unspoken answer hung in the stale, humid air. Yes. This was all that was left. Miles away, on the sun-drenched, windswept deck of the American escort carrier, the USS Streetlow, the war felt entirely different. It was a brutal, terrifying affair, to be sure, but it was a war of logistics, of firepower, of overwhelming industrial might. Petty Officer David Jones, a man whose skin was weathered by sea salt and whose eyes had seen the flash of enemy guns from Midway to Guadalcanal, was supervising a crew of young sailors. They were confident, almost cocky, their movements efficient and practiced. They had the best equipment, the best training, and the unstoppable momentum of victory on their side. One of them was Seaman Apprentice Jimmy O'Connell, a 19-year-old from the green fields of Ohio, for whom the war had, until now, been a series of drills, watches, and eagerly awaited letters from home. He was nicknamed Kid for his boyish face and his wide-eyed enthusiasm. He looked out at the vast blue expanse of the Philippine Sea, a part of the largest fleet ever assembled in the history of naval warfare. Hundreds of ships dotted the horizon, a floating city of steel and purpose. They were, he believed with every fiber of his being, invincible. Then the sky began to fall. The first warnings crackled over the ship's intercom, garbled reports of a large formation of Japanese planes breaking through the combat air patrol. The general quarters alarm blared, a shrill, insistent sound that never failed to send a jolt of pure adrenaline through every sailor. Jones and his crew manned their anti-aircraft guns, their eyes scanning the horizon. They saw them, a swarm of black dots growing larger by the second, like angry hornets pouring from a distant nest. "Here they come, boys," Jones yelled, his voice full of the familiar, grim thrill of combat. "Let's give 'em hell." The sky erupted in a storm of black puffs as the fleet's guns opened up, creating a deadly curtain of flak. But something was wrong. These planes weren't flying like normal bombers. They weren't jinking and weaving to avoid the fire. They were diving, straight down, their engines screaming a high-pitched, terrifying shriek that seemed to tear at the very air. An A6M0, trailing a plume of black smoke from a hit, ignored the wall of steel being thrown up by the fleet and aimed itself directly at the flight deck of the Street Low. "He's not pulling up," O'Connell screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Jones watched, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. He had seen planes shot down, seen them crash in fiery balls of wreckage. But this was different. This was deliberate. The pilot was not trying to drop a bomb. He was the bomb. The Zero slammed into the flight deck with a sickening crunch of metal and a massive fiery explosion that seemed to lift the entire carrier out of the water. The world became a maelstrom of heat, noise, and utter chaos. The deck buckled beneath their feet, and a wave of burning aviation fuel washed across the ship, a river of fire that engulfed everything and everyone in its path. Jones was thrown to the deck, the air knocked from his lungs. He scrambled to his feet, his ears ringing, his eyes stinging from the acrid smoke. He saw men on fire, their screams lost in the deafening roar of the inferno. He looked for O'Connell and found him frozen, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, his eyes fixed on the burning wreckage of the plane that was now a part of their ship. "He was looking right at me," O'Connell muttered, his voice a hollow, trembling whisper. "The pilot, he was looking right at me." The initial shock that had paralyzed the American sailors began to curdle into a new, unfamiliar emotion. It was a mixture of horror and a cold, hardening rage. This wasn't combat as they knew it. It was something else. Something monstrous and deeply personal. Back on Luzon, Admiral Onishi received the first reports. The USS Street Low was sinking. Other ships were heavily damaged. On paper, the mission was a success. But there was no celebration in the bunker. Only the stale smell of cigarette smoke and unspoken dread. The cost of this success was absolute. Each hit had cost a pilot and a plane, resources that were now utterly irreplaceable. Onishi lit another cigarette, his hand trembling slightly. He had unleashed a demon, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would eventually consume them all. Kenji watched as the next wave of pilots prepared for their mission. Ensign Sato, his face pale but his eyes burning with a feverish light, was among them. He was given a ceremonial cup of sake, a final drink before his journey to the afterlife. Kenji saw the boy's hand shake as he took the cup, spilling a few precious drops. It was a child, playing the part of a warrior, a part that would end in a fiery, anonymous death hundreds of miles away over a cold, indifferent ocean. On the listing, burning deck of the Street Low, Jones was in a living hell. He helped the damage control teams fight the raging fires, the heat so intense it blistered the paint on the bulkheads and made the very air shimmer. He carried the wounded, their bodies horribly burned, their moans a constant, agonizing chorus that would echo in his nightmares for years. He helped cover the dead, their forms shrouded in canvas, their youthful faces frozen in a final, silent scream. He saw the gaping, blackened hole in the flight deck, the twisted metal that had once been a plane, and he understood the terrible effectiveness of this new tactic. But he also saw the raw, naked desperation behind it. A nation that had to resort to this was a nation that was already defeated. They just hadn't admitted it to themselves yet. He found O'Connell huddled against a bulkhead, his face streaked with soot and tears, his body shaking uncontrollably. Jones knelt beside him, putting a firm hand on his shoulder. "They can sink our ships, kid," Jones said, his voice rough with emotion and smoke. "They can kill us, but they can't make us quit. You understand? This just makes us want to finish it more." O'Connell looked at him, his eyes full of a horror that would never truly leave him. The divine wind had blown, and it had brought with it a new kind of hell. But in the fires of the USS Street Low, a new, unshakable resolve was being forged. The Kamikaze was meant to be a weapon of terror, but it was backfiring. It was not breaking the American spirit, it was hardening it into a weapon of pure, cold vengeance. The war moved on, a relentless grinding machine chewing up islands and men with brutal indifference. By the spring of 1945, the American war machine had arrived at the doorstep of Japan itself, Okinawa. The turquoise waters around the island, so deceptively peaceful, became the stage for the final, most brutal act of the Kamikaze drama. For the Japanese, it was the ultimate defense of the homeland, a sacred last stand. For the Americans, it was a meat grinder, Petty Officer David Riley was now a gunner's mate on the destroyer USS Laffey. The ship, like Riley, was a veteran, its grey hull scarred and tested by the fires of the Pacific Campaign. It would soon earn a new, almost mythical name, the ship that would not die. Riley was more jaded now. The easy, almost boyish confidence he had possessed on the street, low burned away and replaced by a fatalistic, grim determination. The kamikaze was no longer a shocking new tactic that defied comprehension. It was a daily, horrifying reality. The sailors had developed a dark, morbid routine. They would watch the sky, wait for the inevitable dives, and fight with a desperate, cold fury that left no room for fear, only for action. The shock had worn off, leaving behind a hardened core of resolve. They knew what was coming, and their only thought was to meet it with a wall of fire. The Japanese called the massed kamikaze attacks at Okinawa kikusui, or floating chrysanthemums, a hauntingly poetic name for a horrific spectacle. On one fateful morning, the Laffey found itself on radar picket duty, a lonely sentinel on the edge of the fleet, and it was there that it became the center of one such attack. Over 20 Japanese planes, a swarm of desperate souls, targeted the lone destroyer in a relentless 80-minute assault. The sky, once a brilliant blue, became a chaotic canvas of diving planes, black puffs of flak, and fiery, blossoming explosions. Riley was in the heart of the storm, his 40mm Bofors gun, a roaring, bucking beast in his hands. He fired until the barrel glowed a dull, angry red, the acrid smell of cordite filling his nostrils and stinging his eyes. He didn't think. He just reacted, his body a seamless extension of the weapon. He tracked a diving plane, leading it, firing, watching the tracers stitch a line across its fuselage. The plane shuddered, smoke pouring from its engine, but it kept coming. The ship's intercom crackled, not with panic, but with the calm, steady voice of its captain, Commander Frederick Beckton. "All hands, stand fast," he said, his voice an anchor in the maelstrom. "We are the Laffey. We do not yield." Planes slammed into the ship, one after another, their impacts shaking the destroyer to its very keel. A bomb blast tore through the deck just yards from Riley's position, killing 3 of his crewmates instantly, their bodies vanishing in a flash of light and heat. He didn't have time to mourn, didn't have time to feel anything but the violent shudder of the deck. Another kamikaze, its pilot clearly visible in the cockpit, grazed the mast, its wing cartwheeling across the deck like a giant, severed limb before the rest of the plane plunged into the sea. The ship was on fire in a half-dozen places. Its guns were being knocked out one by one, but it refused to sink. It absorbed the blows, shuddered, and kept fighting. Riley, his face black with soot, his arms aching with a fatigue so deep it felt like it was in his bones, just kept firing. He screamed at his loader, his voice raw and barely human. "Keep 'em coming. Don't let 'em even get close enough to scratch the paint." It was a primal scream, a roar of defiance against the dying of the light, a refusal to be broken by the sky falling around him. Meanwhile, back at a Japanese airbase near Kagoshima, Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka was living a different, more insidious kind of hell. He was now a flight instructor, a role he had come to despise with every fiber of his being. His job was not to teach men how to fight and win, not to pass on the hard, won knowledge of aerial combat that had once made him an ace. His job was to teach them how to die. The pilots he was given were no longer the skilled, disciplined veterans of the early war. They were teenagers, boys with soft faces and nervous hands who had been pulled from schools and farms, given a few dozen hours of rudimentary flight training, and then pointed towards the enemy fleet. They could barely handle the planes on takeoff, let alone navigate hundreds of miles over open ocean and execute a precision dive, bombing attack. They were children being sent to do a man's job. A job that had no return ticket. The planes themselves were a grim testament to Japan's crumbling war machine. They were a motley collection of outdated trainers, patched-up fighters, and even ancient biplanes, their fabric wings a pathetic defense against the storm of American anti-aircraft fire. Kenji was inspecting one such plane with mechanic Ito, an old, weary man whose gnarled hands had serviced planes since before Kenji was born. Ito had seen the rise and fall of Japanese air power, from the gleaming Zeros that had swept the skies at Pearl Harbor to these flying relics. Ito held up a cracked fuel line, his hands stained with grease and grime, his face a mask of quiet resignation. "We are sending them up in flying coffins, Lieutenant," he said, his voice heavy with a sorrow that went beyond words. "We paint the rising sun on them, but they are just paper and prayers. They will be lucky to make it halfway to the target." Kenji looked over at a group of young pilots who were about to take off. They were laughing and joking, a frantic, high-pitched energy about them as they tried to project an image of fearless samurai. But their eyes, when they thought no one was looking, betrayed the stark terror they were trying so hard to conceal. They were boys, not warriors. "They are not pilots," Genji said, his voice barely a whisper, a confession to the old mechanic. "They are sacrifices. We have traded our honor for a desperate hope, and we are losing both." His disillusionment was complete, a bitter ash in his mouth. The noble sacrifice he had once, however reluctantly, believed in was a lie. This wasn't a strategy. It was a national ritual of suicide, a funeral pyre that was consuming the very future of Japan, its youth, its hope, its soul. The divine wind was nothing more than the last, dying breath of a defeated nation. The psychological backfiring of the kamikaze tactic was becoming increasingly clear on the American side, a strange and unexpected consequence of the horror. In a makeshift hospital on a ship anchored in the relative safety of the waters off Okinawa, David Riley was visiting Jimmy O'Connell. The boy from Ohio had survived the sinking of the street, low, only to be wounded in the attack on the Laffey, where he had been transferred after his first ordeal. He had lost a leg just below the knee, but he had not lost his spirit. In fact, the wide-eyed fear that had once consumed him had been burned away and replaced by something else, something colder and harder. Riley, expecting to find a broken young man, was taken aback by the look in O'Connell's eyes. Riley tried to offer words of comfort, clumsy phrases about being a hero, about going home, but O'Connell wasn't looking for pity. He waved it away with a thin, tired hand. "I used to be scared of him, Riley," he said, his voice quiet but firm, lacking any trace of the tremor it had held on the deck of the Streetlow. "When that first one hit us, I thought I'd never stop being scared. But now I just feel sorry for him." He shifted in his cot, gesturing with his head towards the open sea. "They gotta be pretty damn desperate to do that, to willingly fly into a wall of steel. They know they've lost. They have to. They're just trying to take as many of us with them as they can before it's all over." Riley looked at the young man, at the determined set of his jaw, at the empty space beneath the blanket where his leg used to be, and he understood. The kamikaze attacks were not breaking their morale. They were galvanizing it in a way no speech from a general ever could. The sailors were no longer just fighting an enemy in a distant, abstract war. They were fighting an enemy that was looking them in the eye as it tried to kill them. The attacks were a constant, visceral reminder of what they were fighting against, and it filled them with a righteous, unyielding determination. It made the war personal. "You're right, kid," Riley said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "It's not about being scared anymore. It's about finishing the job. For you, for all the guys we lost. We're gonna finish it, no matter what." The kamikaze, the ultimate weapon of terror, had failed in its primary objective. It had not broken the will of the American sailor. It had not instilled a paralyzing fear that would halt the advance of the fleet. Instead, it had hardened that will into a diamond, sharp point, aimed directly at the heart of the Japanese Empire. The divine wind was blowing back, and it was fanning the flames of a fire that would soon consume Japan itself. The horror of the tactic was not creating cowards, it was creating crusaders, men who now saw the end of the war not just as a duty, but as a moral necessity. The desperation of the enemy was not a sign of their strength, but a clear, undeniable signal of their impending collapse, and it only made the men fighting them more determined to bring that collapse about as quickly as possible. The final days of the war were a slow, agonizing descent into the inevitable. Japan was a nation on its knees, its body broken and its spirit bleeding out. Its cities, once vibrant hubs of culture and industry, were being systematically incinerated by relentless American firebombing raids, leaving behind vast, silent landscapes of rubble and ash that stretched as far as the eye could see. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of the nation and the terror of the Pacific, was a ghost fleet, its mightiest vessels resting at the bottom of the sea. The army, starved and cut off, was withering on isolated islands across the ocean, a testament to a strategy that had long since collapsed. Yet, in the subterranean bunkers of Tokyo, the military leadership, disconnected from the reality of the streets above, clung to the fantasy of a final, decisive battle. They spoke of the spirit of the Japanese people, the Yamato Damashi, as if it were a tangible weapon, a force that could somehow turn back the tide of steel and fire. This spirit, they decreed, would be embodied in one last, glorious act of defiance, the kamikaze. Admiral Onishi, the architect of the Special Attack Corps, looked like a ghost haunting the halls of his own failed strategy. The weight of the thousands of young lives he had sent to their deaths had carved deep, dark lines into his face, pulling his skin taut over his skull. He rarely slept, and when he did, his dreams were filled with the faces of boys, their eyes burning with patriotic fire as they flew into oblivion. He had promised them that their sacrifice would be the divine wind that saved the empire, but all it had become was a whirlwind of self-destruction. Still, the machine he had set in motion demanded more fuel. He was ordered to orchestrate one last, massive kamikaze attack, a final, futile gesture of defiance against the armadas gathering for the invasion of the homeland. It was an order born of madness, a demand for a miracle from a god that had long since fallen silent. For this final act, Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka was chosen to lead. The news came to Kenji not as an honor, but as a death sentence. He had known it was coming. He was one of the few remaining veteran pilots, a relic from an era when pilots were expected to return. His name carried a weight that the leadership hoped would inspire the terrified boys he would lead. Kenji knew it was a suicide mission in the truest sense of the word. It was not a mission with a chance of success, however slim. It was a ritual of self-immolation, a final, desperate act in a play that had already ended. He was given one of the last operational Zero fighters, a machine that was more a museum piece than a weapon of war, its engine coughing and sputtering, its metal skin patched and repatched. The night before his final flight, Kenji sat down to write a final letter to his family. The paper was cheap, the ink thin, but his hand was steady. He did not write of glory or honor, for he felt he had neither. He did not write of dying for the emperor, a concept that now felt hollow and distant. He wrote of love, of regret, of the simple, beautiful things he was leaving behind. He wrote of the scent of the cherry blossoms in his mother's garden in the spring, of the taste of his father's homemade noodles, of the sound of his little sister's laughter. "I fly not for the emperor," he wrote, his heart heavy with a sorrow too deep for tears, nor for victory, which has long since left us. "I fly for the memory of my friends, for the honor that we have lost in this madness, and in the faint, desperate hope that my death will be the last, and that a new Japan may one day rise from these ashes, a Japan that values life more than death, a Japan that will remember us not as gods, but as lost boys." He folded the letter, placing it inside his flight suit, a final, silent testament to the man he was, not the weapon he was forced to become. He led his squadron into the gray, pre-dawn sky, a pathetic remnant of the once mighty naval air force. The planes struggled to gain altitude, their engines straining. They were a collection of ghosts, flown by boys who should have been in school, their faces pale and grim. Kenji looked at his wingmen, at the fear in their eyes, and his heart broke. Before they even reached the open sea, the futility of the mission became tragically clear. Two of the planes, their engines failing, simply gave up and ditched into the cold water below. Another, flown by a pilot who could not have been more than 16, lost control and spiraled into a fatal spin, a tiny, insignificant puff of smoke on the horizon. Those that did make it through were met by a sky black with flak. The American fleet, alerted by radar hours before, was waiting. The gunners, honed by months of constant, brutal attacks, were now brutally efficient. Their radar, directed guns created an impenetrable curtain of steel, a wall of death that reached up from the sea. Petty Officer David Riley, now on the aircraft carrier USS Essex, watched the battle unfold, not from a gun turret, but on a radar screen in the dim, quiet confines of the Combat Information Center. The Japanese planes appeared as small green blips, approaching in a ragged, desperate formation. Then, one by one, they vanished. A calm, detached voice from the radar operator called out their demise. "Splash one, splash another. Target group is disintegrating." It was no longer a terrifying, chaotic spectacle. It was a slaughter, methodical and remote. There was no screaming, no fire, just the quiet, clinical removal of blips from a screen. Kenji saw his squadron disintegrate around him. Planes exploded in mid-air, their fragments raining down into the indifferent sea. He was alone, a single, desperate warrior against an entire fleet. He pushed his Zero into a dive, aiming for the carrier Riley was on, the largest shape he could see. He was a pilot, a warrior, and he would die like one, his hand on the stick, his eyes on the enemy. But his plane, already damaged, was shredded by a storm of cannon fire from the carrier's defensive screen. The controls went limp in his hands, and his world became a blur of smoke, fire, and the cold gray sea rushing up to meet him. In his final moment, he did not see the face of the enemy or the glory of the emperor. He saw his mother's garden, the cherry blossoms falling like snow. He was not a divine wind. He was just another casualty, a boy who had loved to fly, consumed by a war that had long been lost. "That's the last of 'em," the radar operator said to Riley, his voice devoid of emotion, as the final blip vanished from the screen. They didn't even get close. Riley stared at the empty screen, a profound and unexpected sense of sadness washing over him. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching weariness. There was no triumph, no thrill of victory, just a quiet, empty feeling. He thought of the men in those plains, of their final, terrifying moments, and for the first time, he felt not rage, but a deep, profound pity. "So this is how it ends," he whispered to himself, the words lost in the low hum of the electronics. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. A few weeks later, the war was over. The atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Emperor, in a voice never before heard by his people, had spoken of surrender. David Riley was part of the American occupation force that landed in Japan. He walked through the ruins of Tokyo, a landscape of utter devastation that defied description. It was a city of ghosts, a silent, grey world of rubble and ash that stretched as far as the eye could see. He saw the hollowed-out shells of buildings, the twisted skeletons of streetcars, the silent, ghostly figures of the survivors, their faces blank with shock and grief. He felt no triumph, no sense of victory. The hatred and rage that had sustained him through the long, bloody years of the war had been burned away, leaving only a deep, profound sorrow for all that had been lost on both sides. One day, his patrol took him to the outskirts of the city, to what was once a major airbase. He found the old mechanic, Ito, sifting through the wreckage of the hangars, his gnarled hands trying to salvage something, anything, from the debris. Ito looked up as Riley approached, his eyes old and weary. They did not speak the same language. They had been mortal enemies just weeks before, but in that moment they shared a look of mutual understanding, of shared loss, of the bone, deep weariness of men who had seen too much of war. Riley saw in Ito's eyes the same sorrow he felt in his own heart. He gave the old man a slight, respectful nod, and Ito, after a moment's hesitation, returned it. There was nothing more to say. Back in the ruins of Tokyo, Admiral Takejiro Onishi had performed the final act of his own personal tragedy. In his office, surrounded by the ghosts of his dead pilots, he had committed seppuku, ritual suicide. He had not gone quickly. He had refused the traditional coup de grace, choosing to linger in agony for hours, as if to atone for the suffering he had caused. He had left a note, not of defiance, but of apology. It was addressed to the souls of the young pilots he had sent to their deaths and to their families. "I wish to express my deepest appreciation to the souls of the many brave special attackers," he wrote. "I apologize to the souls of these dead flyers and their bereaved families. In death, I wish to atone for my part in the failure to achieve victory." The story of the Kamikaze is a story of terrible, tragic irony. The weapon that was meant to be the salvation of the Japanese Empire was the very thing that hastened its demise. It was a strategy born of desperation, and it revealed to the world, and most importantly, to the enemy, the true depth of that desperation. It consumed Japan's most precious and irreplaceable resources, its skilled pilots and its aircraft, leaving the homeland virtually defenseless against the firestorms that would consume its cities. And, most importantly, it failed to break the will of its enemy. Instead, it hardened their resolve, turning a war of strategy and logistics into a moral crusade of extermination. The divine wind had failed to blow. It had become a whirlwind of self-destruction, a tragic, haunting testament to the folly of a nation that had chosen death over surrender, and in doing so, had lost everything. The cherry blossoms had fallen, not in a brief, spectacular moment of glory, but in a long, agonizing storm that had stripped the nation bare, leaving only the hope of a new spring.